LA Youth Orchestra.
Sorry,
Um,
Kaley.
that's okay. I got it. I'm okay for recording. And so that's when I really started spending a lot of time with young people and seeing what kind of music was interesting to them. And of course, I saw a lot of parallels with my history as a classical musician that was always interested in kind of other types of music. That all happened, and I was composing all the time. And then I ended up at the University of Washington in Seattle doing my Doctor of Musical Arts in composition. And the reason why I was dying to go to UW is because of their kind of state of the art technology that they have there, ambisonic speakers, the rooms that have these incredible setups, the sort of very forward-looking approach to technology and music technology. Of course, being in Seattle, is a big reason for that as well. So when I was in my doctorate studying composition, that's when I became really obsessed with open source music technology, super collider, computer programming in music, and then that sort of was coupled with an interest in music production. Throughout all of this, I have been a singer-songwriter. So when I was looking for teaching work after my doctorate, I wanted to combine all of these things and be able to find myself in a place where I could take my background of doing all of these different things and me feeling that like that was making me a really interesting musician that felt empowered to make the kind of music that I wanted to make. I was just really interested in being able to create curriculums and foster that kind of well-roundedness in an undergraduate program with students, because I never had that. I had to do 4 degrees to be able to study all the things I wanted to study. What if we could integrate that all in the undergraduate experience? So that's kind of what ended up, that's how I found myself at Cornish, was the desire at Cornish to do that same thing. And it was a natural fit when I started there in 2018. So when I was hired at Cornish, even though my background had all these classical things, I was hired as the director of music technology because I had kind of accrued this interesting practice as a composer of electroacoustic music. And I was very interested in improvisation with electronics. I kind of approached everything from the back door. I didn't learn a DAW when I was in my 20s and then make music that way. I learned open source software. I was very unconventional path. And so that was the kind of thinking that we wanted to use at Cornish to see if we could solve some problems that we had there. So before I kind of talk about the specific problems that we had at Cornish and that I experienced in my education, I'm curious, maybe people can just sort of throw in the chat, since we don't have time for everyone to talk at once, just throw in the chat maybe some problems that come to mind when you are thinking about getting a traditional music degree from an undergraduate institution in 2022. I'm talking about a traditional Bachelor of Music conservatory degree. That is starting to look different in a lot of places, but I think probably all of us who are educators have an idea of what that is. And it'd be interesting to just sort of put your mind for a second of what are some problems with that? We've obviously addressed that in the video and the opening remarks as well, and that's kind of why we're all here, right? And then as we think about that, we also want to think about, well, what are the problems with getting started working with music technology at any point in one's life or career? The sort of different answers to that, right? I think that in a lot of circles, there tends to be an assumption that music technology is more accessible for young people because it's maybe the sounds that we can make with a DAW are more relevant to what young people are listening to. But there are significant barriers. There are class barriers. This technology remains expensive. It's cheaper than it's ever been, right? But it's still very expensive and inaccessible to a lot of people. I am surprised at how many folks I see coming into an art school that do not have access to a DAW, to microphones, to all the things that you might take for granted if you're someone that works in this practice. Gender barriers, that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. Race, class, all of that. So there are lots of problems in both teaching music technology, teaching music production, and a traditional conservatory degree. So my task as a human being, and then our task at Cornish, was to be what if we can solve both of those problems at once and create a new curriculum and a new way of learning music as an 18 to 22-year-old that allows you to follow what is interesting to you without barriers of style or access or any of the things that we might associate with these two issues. So these are some of the problems that I had been sitting with for a long time when I started my work at Cornish. I was experiencing an invented separation between academic and non-academic electronic music. In my doctorate, I wanted to do research and present on topics like interactive electronic music. And to me, it was Grandmaster Flash, it was Laurie Anderson, it were all these like underground artists of every genre that you can think of that were the pioneers of electronic music. But that was not generally accepted in a lot of circles that I was in. Electronic music was, oh, we're talking about, you know, spectral composers like musique concrète, the European tradition of like academic computer music. These things, there were people that were invested in those being very separate things. And that never made sense to me at all. So that was something that I was like, well, this doesn't make sense. This is not helpful for young people. What can we do to just literally erase that barrier? Because when you teach Jimi Hendrix alongside, you know, Laurie Anderson alongside, you know, Grisey, like it's helpful, right? It is helpful to look at those folks alongside each other. So that seemed like something that needed to be addressed. Something I noticed a lot in my experience was the othering of music technology as a separate field of study within music. I see this in a lot of different contexts. You major in performance, you major in composition, or maybe you're at a place where you can major in music technology. And that doesn't make any sense to me because music technology is performance, music technology is composition. There's no reason why this has to be like a separate thing from the other aspects of music that we study. If we think about an integrated musicianship, you have to have instrumental skills, performance skills, improvisation skills, notational skills, all of these things, ear training that we learn. Why isn't technology one of those pillars of musicianship, right? So we're wanting to break down that hyper-specialization. There's class stuff with that too. And then as I mentioned, there's a culture of racism, sexism, and classism in all music tech spaces. As a young woman that didn't have a background in music technology, when I started getting into writing electronic music, I can't even tell you, I take the whole session if I could tell you about the times when people didn't believe that I was the person there to perform electronic music. That happened to me this summer. So that is something that I think a lot of us encounter, but our students are still encountering that. We might think of them, the young people today, as coming from a more progressive space, but they're still encountering that. I see that with my students coming in, my femme students, my women identifying students are like, I don't feel like I can do this. That's still happening. And why is that, right? When you look at why that is. And then of course, like I mentioned, economic barriers to engagement with music technology. It's not as simple as, oh, just buy this $200 interface. That's not very simple, right? That's a significant expense for a lot of folks. So those are some things that I'm like noticing and wanting to solve in a curricular design. So we're going to hear a lot about this today from all of our brilliant presenters, I think, but it is important to ask the question, why fix these problems? Of course, I think that musical performance, composition, study, and conversation are weakened by continuing to engage music technology as a separate field or as this thing that is different from the rest of music study. Music technology, conservatory education. There's music that will never be made. There's music that will be stopped from making if we continue to think about those as separate. So that's important to all of us as musicians, right? That music, the vast variety of music and life experiences and artistic expressions out there can exist. Our integrating of these things actually, that depends on our integration of these things. And of course, we want to prevent the hierarchical and problematic structures that are reinforced in the way that music technology spaces have been kind of coded in the past. Young people internalize those, so we need to actually like break that apart. And that's really related to a lot of, you know, DEI work that is happening in institutions now. Music technology needs to be a part of that destructuring as well, right? And then this is a big one for me. Given the society that we live in now and how controlled it is by our relationship with technology, we need people that can understand and feel empowered to harness technology. So if we treat music technology as this other thing that only some people do, only producers do that, or only blah, blah, blah do that, that reinforces this idea that like, oh, only coders can do that. Only the people that are working in the tech industry can understand that. And that is a power, that's a massive problem for democracy. That's a massive problem for, the economy. We need people to understand that we all have a stake in technology. And actually, I think the artistic space in art education is a very important place to start teaching that. Visual arts, music, like, use this technology, understand it, harness it. It is at your mercy. Technology is not above you. You are a human being that can control this thing. We need to teach all students that regardless of their background. So that's really important to me. Okay, so when I got to Cornish with all of this stuff in mind, these are just some of the things that were happening there. I won't spend too much time on this, but the curriculum, like, the reason I identify these is because this is kind of how it is at a lot of different schools that have a traditional music program, right? There was no technology integrated into the music curriculum. There were all these different majors. There's classical instrumental performance, jazz instrumental performance, classical vocal performance, jazz instrumental performance, composition, composer, performer. Each one of these majors had a different curriculum. And so we moved to what's called a one model program that not only was serving to like de-silo genre and practice, musical practices between all these different majors, but I wanted technology then to be folded into that as well. And in this old curriculum, in this way that it was very siloed, we literally only had 2 classes that acknowledged technology at all. And only one was required for the major, which was Intro to Digital Audio Workstations, a single semester. And we all know that that's not really enough time to introduce people to digital audio workstations, right? It was a very kind of lopsided situation for our students. And then we had a composing for electronic media class, which is a wonderful class, which is where a lot of students got their exposure. The issue with that, though, was that happened in their junior and senior years, so they weren't getting this kind of exposure in their early years. And then the space that we had was just not equipped to support a lot of creative activity. It was a very, the studio was very stuffy, and there was 2 channels of input and an old version of Pro Tools, and it was just not a place where you could do anything other than record vocals over a beat that somebody else is making in Pro Tools. It was not equipped to support diverse compositional activities. So when I got there, I did a survey. This is not scientific. This was really just kind of for my own and our chair, James Falzone, who I worked closely with, as well as the rest of the faculty on a lot of these changes. This is not a scientific sociological study, although I did try to retain my methods from my master's in teaching degree. But I took a survey of our students just to see how they would relate their interest in music technology, their comfort level with music technology, and their expertise with music technology. And this survey was taken with that old curriculum that was not acknowledging music technology. I can drop a link in the chat at the end of this to an article that I wrote about this that expands a lot of my discussion of this data. So that's what this link is, because it's vast. There's a lot to kind of interpret, and how our students would comment and rate and speak about these things. But I'll show you here kind of what a general breakdown of some of the data. You can see that there is a gender correlation with a lot of these. It is a small sample size. My hypothesis would be that with a greater sample size, you might actually see more gender correlation. But that is obviously just speculation here. But I think we all can kind of understand why one might speculate that. So obviously, amongst all students, there's a high interest in music technology. You can see that the interest ended up being pretty equal, right, between all expressions of gender. Comfort level is where we started to see male identifying students rated higher there than female identifying students. The boys were more comfortable with the idea of music technology than the women in this situation. And then same thing with expertise, we see that correlation here, right? Lower ratings for female identifying students, higher ratings for male identifying students. So in our gender fluid and non-binary population, and the sample size was pretty small, so we can't really say anything significant about that association, but we can see there is a difference here, even with such a small sample size at a very artistic place that is seemingly progressive. We're still seeing numbers like this. It's concerning, right? But also not surprising. So these are the things that we then set out to do. To destigmatize technology in the musician's mind. This is something that I spoke about when we're thinking about like the faculty in certain institutions that are then maybe charged with integrating technology into the curriculum. That's a big shift for people that may have had a really traditional music education, which is probably most faculty in higher education. So we also need to, the collective we of people that are working in this field, like need to understand that there is a lot going on for the people who will be teaching this to be able to teach it in the way, right? We had faculty where it was like, I don't even know what an XLR cable is because I had a completely classical conservatory education. So we need to like be supporting this, not just the students, but also with faculty that are engaged in this work. So other things, when we integrate technology, it's not just integrating technology to a traditional degree, but it's also just undoing everything canonical, not separating composer from performer, not separating improvisation from composition, and not separating technology from those things. So what we did is we basically crafted a new one model program. This took many years of work. When I entered the conversation, that was sort of the last 2 or 3 years of the work when the technology part needed to be integrated in. So my colleagues did some really beautiful work before I arrived at Cornish, and I want to acknowledge that. We set out to just give students a major that allowed them to excel in all 4 of these areas equally: performance, composition, improvisation, and technology. Important in that is polystylism, big word for just saying we're not teaching classical music. We're also not teaching popular music. That's important as well. We're not just throwing in a music production program into a classical conservatory degree. We're actually disrupting all conceptions of that. When I have students that come to me and say they want to be a producer, I'm like, you have to define what that means, because that's not one single thing anymore, right? So polystylism, and then also just creating inviting physical spaces on campus that allowed our students to feel like they were allowed to be in those spaces making technology. One of those things was our studio, the way that it was designed, the way that there was like this couch that was really, I write a lot about the couch in my article, was really like kind of forcing people to be in these like really intimate sort of cliquey formulations in the space. I actually thought was not very inviting to creativity and reinforced this kind of idea that certain people are allowed to be in this space. So we took the couch out and painted it purple and more people started using it. It's actually true. It made people feel more like they were allowed to be creative in that room. Change the space, change the tools, change the conversation, and change the canon. Those were our guiding principles for this, okay? So I spoke about this in that slide. I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I wanna talk about some artistic things and then some examples, some anecdotes from our students who have gone through this. So something that I think is really important to do when you're working in this integrated curriculum is to resist specialization. You have a student that comes in and says, well, I'm a producer, so I just really want to learn how to like get really good at using all these tools in my DAW. Resist that. Be like, well, if you're a producer, you should also be able to sit down at this piano and improvise something that's interesting. It means you're also a composer, right? Someone coming in saying, I'm a classical violinist, I don't need to learn this. You have to resist that. You say, well, of course you do, because in order to be empowered as a musician in this world, you need to be able to record and express yourself through technology. Otherwise, no one's going to hear what you're doing, right? That's the reality that we live in now. I also encourage resisting using prepackaged tools. I get a lot of students that come in and they're like, what plugins should I buy? What should I buy? What should I buy? What should I buy? I'm like, well, how about you don't buy anything? Like, see how you can be creative within limitations, so we're not just starting to associate like buying stuff with being a better musician. That's something that's really important to me. resist expenses, and create with limitations. A lot of students will think, and faculty as well, like, I can't create electronic music unless I have this expensive thing and this expensive thing and this expensive thing. I want to dissociate expense and cost with creativity. You can create an incredible piece with a mallet and music stand, right? Applying that thinking to technology is really important as well. Resisting that capitalist hold on stuff, right? And something that I think doesn't get talked about that much is to explore and highlight and celebrate what technology does badly. This is an instrument like any other instrument. There are things I can't do on the piano. I can't crescendo a note on the piano. So if I'm going to be using this piece of technology to compose a piece, I need to exploit that. I need to write something that acknowledges that the piano cannot crescendo on a single note. Similarly, when we're using the laptop as an instrument, I think that you can develop a deeper understanding of what this instrument is if you understand what it cannot do. So I'm always encouraging my students to use recorded acoustic sounds and processing those versus using a MIDI sample of a piano. If we're using a MIDI sample of a piano, why can't we just use a real piano, right? Like looking at like, what is the reason behind using this tool instead of this tool so that there's intention behind everything. And for me, I get there by thinking about, all right, what can my laptop not do, right? I need to know that so I can use it meaningfully. All right, so these are some of the courses that we developed in our curriculum to try to solve these problems and to try to get to these solutions. Our first years take a class all together called Sound in Theory and Practice. And this is an introduction to sound as a naturally occurring phenomenon, as the raw material of artistic practice. And we also learned about the physics of sound and psychoacoustics. A lot of it is based on kind of the Church of Pauline Oliveira's deep listening. We also work a lot with some of John Cage's writing and thinking. So we're kind of meditating on what sound is, capturing sound through technology, looking at sound through technology. I was using Ableton in this class yesterday to show people like how timbre and spectra are, how spectra shows us how a timbre can be different from another timbre, and just kind of using the technology to show the differences and the fundamentals of sound, right? So it becomes this philosophical course, but technology is fully integrated into it. So they're learning about what sound is through using technology. It's not an Ableton class. It's not a found sound music concrete class. It's like, let's think about sound. And yeah, we'll learn this tool along the way. But the point is to develop this deep relationship with sound itself and the tool as a means to an end, not as the end itself. That's kind of a serious philosophical underpinning of all of this. Okay, so all of our first years take that. Some of them have technical knowledge, some of them don't, and they're all on the same playing field with us. The most kind of interesting part, I think, of our curriculum in doing this, and the most kind of daring and out of the box, is that we scrapped all music theory, we scrapped all ear training, we scrapped all intro to DAW, intro to notation software, and we just created a sequence called musicianship. And in musicianship, this is an example of an assignment that one might do in musicianship. They're learning Ableton, they're learning chord progressions, they're learning classical theory, they're learning ear training, they're learning all of that stuff in musicianship. And sometimes they're using technology, again, like in the other class, as a means to an end, as a way to develop their understanding of modulations, you know, rhythmic, harmonic rhythm, all of the things that we associate with music theory. If you can learn it on staff paper, by ear, and on a piano roll, and as a performer on your instrument with your voice on a keyboard, then you fully understood that musical concept. So again, the technology is not, okay, we're taking an Ableton class now. It's, we're using this tool to learn all these other aspects of musicianship. So this is an example of an assignment that would do that. It's a composition, chords and melody, that is using all these concepts that they've learned, but then they have to record it in time using MIDI. And then they also have to notate it in finale. So it's like we're using all of these tools at the same time, learning what some might think of as more traditional theoretical concepts. They're also learning experimental theoretical concepts and non-Western theoretical concepts too. But the technology allows them to learn it from every facet, okay? Then they take a fundamentals of electronic music class following these two courses or these two sequences that allows them to go deeper into different traditions. So we use a DAW here, we use an analog synth, we use turntables to learn the origins of DJing and sampling and things like that. And by the time they get to this class in their second year, they don't have to learn Ableton in this class. They already understand it as a tool that is as basic as the keyboard, that allows them to deepen their understanding of the fundamentals of electronic music. Similarly, after they take that, then in their third and fourth years, they have an elective that's just a topics in music technology class that rotates every year what that might be. Last year, I developed the class Performing with Electronics. And after having gone through that musicianship sequence, that sound class, and this fundamentals class, now they're perfectly suited to start doing crazy stuff with technology and focusing on that in a class because they already have this well-rounded musicianship happening outside of that. So these are just some of the things that my students did. These are all students that had no experience with technology when they started college, did these projects. Someone did a voice going into a looper. The looper is going into Ableton. Envelope followers and LFOs are chained together on a live voice signal. It's just crazy stuff. But the student didn't know any of that before they started our sequence. And now they're doing that kind of activity. So you can kind of see these. A really fun one was a drummer who was like, I'm just going to tape contact mics to every instrument on my kit, and then I'm going to have it set up to trigger different events in Ableton. It was crazy, but it was cool. So they were able to go deeper into these projects because of how we set them up in their curriculum prior to that. And then, of course, we have these composition topics. Composing for film and media. In this class, they don't have to learn how to use the DAW to do it. They already know how to use the DAW, so they can think deeper about the scores that they're making, right? They can think deeper about combining acoustic instruments with electronic sounds, sound design and Foley. Like when they get to this class as a junior, they don't have to sit there and be like, oh my gosh, like where is the record button? They already know how to do that stuff, so they can get deeper into the content. And then same thing with these other topics that might come up, composing for electronic media. They already know all the tools, so they can think about conceptually at that point in their junior and senior year. And then something that has been really interesting is sort of, long story short, replacing the idea of a junior and senior recital with something that could be a recorded project or an installation or something integrating technology into it. So we're no longer just doing junior and senior recitals. We're just, having our juniors do a project, having our seniors do a project that may or may not use technology in a certain way. Something that's really crucial to me is we get a lot of singer-songwriters that come to college that sing and play guitar and write songs, sing and play piano and write songs. And I think it's really important to prioritize having those students learn how to produce their own music, because then they are empowered as in their holistic musicianship. They don't have to find a producer to help them get their vision out there because they don't know the tools. There's a big gender thing happening there. I see a lot of like male singer-songwriters that come to me. They're like producing their own music, but a lot of young women that are like, I need somebody else to produce my music. And they're always my go-to of like, no, you don't. Let's learn how to do that in our private instruction. And then of course that's supported through their coursework. If they're just learning Ableton and other things like that as a tool alongside their musicianship, then they can just start doing that on their own as well.
Hey, Kaley, sorry, just a note, it's about time for Q&A. Okay. You can go ahead and finish this slide.
Yeah, I'm gonna just share, I wanted to just share this one, some examples of our students that have gone through this curriculum. So example, these are all real students. One is a singer-songwriter who came to us as a singer-songwriter who had no technological know-how. She had kind of like encountered these producers when she was a teenager that wanted to like work with her. And so she would like find herself in the studio and they were like producing her music, but she didn't want that experience. She wanted to produce her own music. So she came to Cornish and through this curriculum just was able to learn how to do that. And now she works at a studio and she's an engineer and she produces other people's music, and including her own. Amazing transformation in 4 years. Another example is, I'm going to jump to student 3 here. This is one of my favorite examples. Came to us as a classical violinist, by the book, totally like Suzuki Conservatory, Second year, started deciding that she was actually really interested in folk music and wanted to learn how to fiddle. And of course, at Cornish, we were able to get her a fiddle teacher. And she was also very curious about Dawes. And so to her, that just ended up being the same thing. So her senior recital was like her doing Appalachian fiddle tunes, singing, songwriting, and then playing fiddle with live electronics. Because to her, she was like, well, this is who I am as a musician. I'm a folk fiddle that plays with electronics. So, and let's see, there's a transfer student that I want to acknowledge too that transferred to our school because he was doing so much with electronic composition and music production that just there was no place for that in the school, in the curriculum of the school that he was at. And so but he was also a little bit weird and creative and out of the box. So he didn't want to just go get a music production degree. And so he came to us, and he now has this incredible body of just really interesting dance, music, ambient composition, that I don't know how he would have been able to find that voice somewhere that wasn't as integrated. So I'll stop there. That pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about in terms of how we are teaching music technology in this forward-thinking way at Cornish. And yeah, Q&A.
Awesome.
How do we do this?
Thanks, Kaley. Yeah, people have put some stuff into chat. I'm gonna just pick a few. We have 5 minutes, so maybe just one or two. So let's start with this question from Dylan, aka Il Gates, who's also presenting next in this room. In my opinion, music history is properly understood as a history of rule breaking, which then became the norm. Do you teach rule breaking? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I teach all the rules, and then I teach about how everybody broke them. I mean, I don't know how you can teach music without that. That kind of ties into my topic about understanding what your tools do badly. If there's a way that you are going to use an instrument, be it a laptop or a different instrument, in a way that's unconventional, in a way that breaks the way that things should be used, like that could be really, really interesting. But you can really only do that well if you fundamentally understand what the thing can't do, right? So yeah, to me, understanding the rules, I know it sounds cliche, but it is really true, right? Understanding what those are in order to like totally not screw them, just totally not do them is a great thing to do. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Great. We definitely have time for another one. How about, this one's pretty interesting. So given, this is from Corey, who's a high school teacher. Given the very real limitation of non-musicians taking a 1-semester composition class in high school with no prereqs, what part of capital M musicianship is priority number 1? Embedded in this question is the challenge of balancing the need to teach chords, ear, music fundamentals against the need to teach technology, Ableton, recording, MIDI, sampling, etc.
Yeah, that's a huge question. Not sure I could talk about that all day. I would say for me, the first thing is just the physical kinesthetic relationship with music. So if you can just like get a student at a piano or at something where they can make noise, have them make the noise, right? Have them feel empowered to improvise with that tool. That might look like, hey, I plugged in this MIDI keyboard to this computer so that you can mess around with it and hear these different sounds. Music is fundamentally a physical activity, right? I really believe that. So that's what I would prioritize first. If we think about how we all started playing music, I started playing music as a 3-year-old that was just in kinder music, learning to hit stuff and play on the piano and make noise. That is where my love of music came from. And I try to like always have that as a musician, no matter what the tools are that I'm using. We actually need to embrace that level of play with older teens and young adults as well, and even older adults. I'm always trying to do that. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so maybe one last question here. We got a request from Ivy. Can you recommend resources, books, guides, studies for cis male educators to learn how to better enable an inclusive educational space for non-cis male students?
And that's also a big question. I would say the number one thing to do, I mean, there's not a lot of guides or stuff written about that, right? That's the problem. So the number one thing to do is just to make sure that the examples in your class and in your syllabus are diverse, we in 2020, our music department had an intention that we followed through with, that all of the examples, the musical examples that we used in all of our musicianship classes would be from people of color, from musicians of color. And we did that. It wasn't hard to do. So that was just, and we didn't need to talk about it. It was just like, oh, here's a Stevie Wonder example, because of course, right? It's not like you have to compromise the kind of music that you're showing to your students. But I think a representation is huge. So I mean, there's now some great documentaries. What's that documentary called? Pink Noise or something, about like women in electronic music, anything like that. Like, just show your students music made by people that look like them. That is the number one thing that you can do. And that means you have to do your own research sometimes to do that. But there are probably people, you know, in your circles that can support that. So number one thing to do.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Eaton. This has been a really amazing presentation, and we're ending exactly on time, which is beautiful, beautiful thing. So thank you so much. The next session in this room is going to be Teaching for Output with Il Gates. So feel free to, I'm going to post the schedule right now of the next set of sessions. Feel free to move to another breakout room or stay here if you want to watch the next session in this room. So thanks for being here, everyone. And thanks, Kaley.
Thank you.
Pardon me, sorry to break the awkward silence.
Yeah.
I wasn't able to get into the initial like opening remarks and stuff. So I was just curious, are the materials such as your keynote presentation going to become available? Or I noticed that this is being recorded, or those kind of things?
So unfortunately, the initial talks were pretty short, that those actually weren't recorded, but we are recording each of the individual breakout rooms and planning to make those available to everybody in some way. So that is the plan.
Oh, amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so very much.
Of course.
This is awesome.
And let me just check in with Dylan. Are you in here and good to go?
I sure am. I can't wait.
Thanks for being here. Yes, super excited for your session. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, it should be pretty fun. I don't normally get to present to educators, and I have some very strong opinions about music education that I can't wait to share.
Yes. We're all up for a rude awakening, right?
Well, it's actually going to be a very polite Canadian awakening.
Yeah, cool. Cool.
Sweet. Okay,
sorry, we can hold off another 3 minutes. I'm going to start us right at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So I just wanted to make sure you were here and good to go. But
okay, I'll go back to lurking.
I'll do a proper little intro when we're ready to get it started.